Mr. President, I want to talk a little bit about an agreement that very well could be reached between now and the time that the Senate returns right after the 4th of July. The agreement that's been negotiated for 2 years now with Iran, though it seems to me that using the term negotiation is a stretch. Most of what we said we wanted to achieve in this so-called negotiation, the Iranians have said they didn't want to achieve, and we seem to then move forward to the next point once we concede that point. Yesterday I read in press reports that the State Department has now decided it won't demand a full accountability for the past nuclear research on the part of Iran before they conclude a deal. One of the early statements was, we want to know what Iran did, how long they've been doing it, what scientists were involved, what material and what information they had achieved in their efforts to actually have a nuclear weapon. It appears now that we're happy if Iran is just nuclear weapons capable with a clock that would start at some time. And we seem to feel we have suddenly new ability to monitor everything Iran does, even though we don't appear to have the ability to get them to tell us what they have done. As I've said before, Mr. President, this is one of the areas where there is no question that no deal is better than a bad deal. According to the State Department, who just recently reported again that Iran should still be considered a country that that encourages terrorism, that in fact you can make the case that there is no greater encourager of terrorist activities in the world today than Iran. But all of those seem to be off the table as we talk to Iran. The true nature of the regime, why we want to have an agreement on just a nuclear program and let all of the other things Iran is going on continues to be of great concern to me. The news reports today were that the Iranian parliament, the Iranian legislature, will now finalize legislation demanding that we not be able to look at military sites as part of our inspection. Well, if the goal here is to stop Iran from having a nuclear capability, having a nuclear weapon, having the military capacity to use a nuclear weapon, why would we take military sites off the list of things that we're supposed to pay attention to? I mean, where would we expect them to be finally developing a weapon, if not at a military site? The Iranian parliament appears to have a whole lot more to say about this negotiation than the United States Senate appears to have a lot to say. In fact, I'm afraid we're going to find with the legislation that we did vote on that it's going to be a lot easier to prevent disapproval than it would have ever been to get approval of this agreement that looks like it's headed toward a very bad agreement. The supreme leader in Iran has ruled out any long-term freezes on nuclear activities and demands that sanctions be lifted immediately. Now, when we, a few weeks ago, said when the United States said our understanding of what the framework moving forward would be, it seems to be about 180 degrees different from what Iran is announcing every day. They want immediate sanctions relief. We say they're only going to get sanctions relief when they begin to comply. They don't want to have inspections at military sites. We say one of the reasons that we want to have this agreement is so we can ensure that nothing happens at military sites. Meanwhile, Iran advances violence and instability around the world. Supported by Iran, Assad in Syria is massacring his own people. So far, at least 190,000 Syrians have been killed in what's going on in Syria today. Iran is supporting that regime. Shiite militias support Assad. They promote division and wage violence outside of Syria now into Iraq, encouraged by Iran. Supported by Iran, Houthi rebels have seized key territory in Yemen and seek to overthrow the government. And by the way, I'd remind the president that this was something that less than a year ago, President Obama said was a great example of how our foreign policy under his leadership was working. That Yemen was an example. Only a few months later, we are fleeing the country and closing our embassy, which actually the president may have been right. Maybe Yemen is a great example of how our foreign policy is working. Hezbollah in Lebanon wages terrorism against Israel, encouraged by Iran. Palestinian terrorists in Gaza, encouraged by Iran, continue to lob mortars and rockets into Israel. Last April, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard stopped a Marshall Islands flagship in the Straits of Hormuz. Iran continues to hold hostages without any reasonable charge. 3 American citizens, Pastor Saeed Abedini, former U.S. Marine Amir Hekmati, and Washington Post journalist Jason Rezaian, are all being held by Iran. A 4th American, former FBI official Robert Levinson, is missing in Iran with no assistance from Iran to find him, if in fact they don't know exactly where he is. I've repeatedly called, as others in the Congress have, on the administration to just stop negotiations until some show of good faith to let these Americans go. I saw just a few days ago where Pastor Abedini was beaten again in the prison he's been put in, the most dangerous prison in Iran. How could we not get 3 people that they're holding under charges that won't stand up in any public view? How could we allow them to continue to hold these people, and we continue to have talks about something like letting this country become nuclear capable? The Washington Post reporter, Jason Rezaian, was arrested after security forces raided his home. His case was referred to a revolutionary court on January the 14th of this year, but details of his charges or details of his court date have not been released. His mother is concerned, as we all should be, about his health, which is deteriorating as he's being imprisoned. Recent reports would suggest that this Washington Post reporter is being charged with espionage. Pastor Abedini was in prison in September of 2012. In January of 2013, he was sentenced to 8 years in prison for, quote, practicing his religion, end quote. That's his crime, practicing his religion. The Iranian government charged that Pastor Saeed Abedini he was undermining the Iranian government by creating a network of Christian house churches and attempting to sway Iranian youth away from Islam. In August of 2013, his appeal was denied. He was then put in the worst prison in the country. He's been beaten up in prison. I think he's been beaten in hospitals when he had to be taken there as his life was almost ended with prison beatings. Why do they still have him? Why do they have Amir Hekmati, a former U.S. Marine who was arrested while visiting his family in Iran in August of 2011? The Iranian government sentenced him to death for espionage. Fortunately, his death sentence was overturned by an appeals court in March of 2012. However, he was still convicted for aiding a hostile nation. That would be us, by the way, aiding a hostile nation and being guilty of espionage. Bob Livingston, who's a retired DEA and FBI agent, disappeared in March of 2007 while visiting Iran's Kish Island. Very likely, many people believe that Mr. Livingston is currently a prisoner in Iran. Just 3 weeks after he disappeared, Iranian state television reported that he was in the hands of Iranian security forces. What are we doing here assuming that the Iranians will agree to something much more complicated when they won't let these 4 people go? Why wouldn't we insist on that? And finally, Iran is responsible for killing and maiming thousands of American servicemen and women in Iraq and Iran from deadly, armor-piercing, improvised explosive devices that were originated in Iran. They don't deny it. I think they take pride in it. The destabilizing impact, Mr. President, of a nuclear weapons-capable Iran is hard to overstate. If you want to do one thing that casts a huge shadow over the next decade and perhaps decades of this century, unless that shadow somehow is removed before the end of a decade, it's hard to imagine. Sanctions with the credible threat of military force were doing good until we decided that we would ease those sanctions, or as if Iran would come to the negotiating table. 2 years ago, that began. 2 years ago, we said things that we would insist on. 2 years later, none of those things appear to be things that are still being discussed in these Iranian so-called negotiations. Sanctions should stay in place until Iran fundamentally changes its course and its behavior. I'm greatly concerned that the agreement on Iran's nuclear program will not be presented to the Congress in a way that allows the Congress to really weigh in, and I am concerned that this program, as it will be presented to the Congress, will establish Iran as a nuclear-capable, nuclear threshold state. When that happens, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan have all stated that they will claim the exact same rights to do whatever it is we allow Iran to do. If we come up with an agreement that says Iran will be within 6 months of having a nuclear weapon, and they have to tell us when they start that 6-month clock, other countries will also want to be within 6 months of a nuclear weapon. And if we believe we can monitor Iran within 6 months or 12 months or whatever the number is, I just think, Mr. President, we are kidding ourselves, and most of the world doesn't believe that we can do this either. Turkey and other countries outside of the immediate neighborhood will also want to view nuclear weapons capability as a new status quo in a dangerous world. An agreement that doesn't change the terror threat from Iran, an agreement that doesn't allow inspection for military facilities, an agreement that doesn't disclose past secret research for nuclear weapons, an agreement that doesn't ensure long-term inspections, an agreement that doesn't maintain sanctions in place until important compliance benchmarks are made is not agreement that would be good enough. We are facing a dangerous time. Iran is one of the chief perpetrators of terrorism in the world today. How we let that country that has one example of bad behavior after another, one example of hatred for Israel after another, one example of contempt for the United States after another, how we let that country become nuclear capable is amazing to me as it is to the world. This is why our friends question whether they can depend on the United States of America any longer, and why our enemies aren't afraid of us as you'd want your enemies to be. I hope that we don't settle for a bad deal, and I'll say again, a bad deal is worse, Mr. President, than no deal at all.